I am Claire, 34 years old and sitting in a freezing mahogany-paneled law office about to watch my father try to erase my existence. My grandfather had just passed away, and at his will reading, my father smirked in front of the entire family, sliding a crisp $100 bill across the table. "Take a cab home to your miserable apartment, Claire," he announced loudly. "You are getting absolutely nothing today." But when the lawyer opened the final sealed envelope and read my name aloud, my father was the one gasping for air. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a family that constantly underestimated your worth. The air in Mr. Kensington's office was suffocating. The heavy leather chairs and the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner made the room feel like a pressure cooker. I sat at the far end of the massive conference table, purposefully keeping my distance from the united front of my family. The damp Seattle weather outside matched the coldness inside. My father Richard sat at the head of the table like a king awaiting his crown. My mother Patricia sat perfectly poised beside him, meticulously adjusting her designer silk scarf, while my younger sister Amanda tapped her acrylic nails impatiently on the polished wood. Before Mr. Kensington even had the chance to open his thick leather binder, my father leaned forward. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his silver money clip, and deliberately peeled off a single $100 bill. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he slid it across the long table. The crisp paper glided over the smooth mahogany and stopped right in front of my folded hands. "Take a cab home to your miserable apartment, Claire," my father said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Save us all the awkwardness, You are getting nothing today. You know it, and I know it." I stared at the bill, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation in my chest. But my mother did not reprimand him. Instead, she gently patted his arm in agreement, offering me a look of feigned, condescending pity. "Really, Claire," she sighed, her voice soft but laced with venom. "Your father is just being practical. You never had a head for family matters, and grandfather knew that. It is better you leave now before you get your feelings hurt." Amanda chimed in, barely looking up from the glowing screen of her phone. "Honestly, Claire, I do not even know why you took the morning off work. Do not you have some spreadsheets to color code or whatever it is you do in that cubicle all day? A number-crunching desk jockey does not need to sit in on high-level asset distributions," my father added, chuckling at his own joke. "Stick to your little calculator, sweetheart. Let the adults handle the real business of running this family." I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the table. They had always spoken to me this way. For my entire life, they viewed my career choice as a pathetic joke. To Richard, a man who built his entire identity on the flashy, high-stakes world of commercial real estate development, my job was nothing more than pushing pencils for pennies. He loved to parade his wealth driving luxury cars and hosting lavish country club dinners, relying entirely on the appearance of immense success and crushing anyone who did not fit his perfect image. I was the scapegoat, the quiet daughter who refused to play the game of keeping up appearances. What none of them knew, because none of them had ever bothered to ask, was that I was not a simple desk jockey. I was a senior forensic accountant for one of the top financial investigation firms in the country. My entire career was built on dismantling the exact kind of smoke and mirrors my father relied on. I spent my days tracking hidden assets, exposing corporate fraud, and tearing down financial lies for massive corporations. I knew how to read the stories that numbers told, and numbers never lied. But in that room, to them, I was just plain boring. Claire, the family disappointment, who lived in a modest apartment and drove a practical 5-year-old sedan. I did not touch the money. I did not yell, and I did not let a single tear fall. Years of being the emotional punching bag for this family had taught me that any reaction was just ammunition for them to use against me. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath and met my father's arrogant stare with complete chilling calm. "I think I will stay, Richard," I said quietly, deliberately refusing to call him Dad. Grandfather specifically requested my presence here today, and I intend to honor his wishes." My father scoffed a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet room. He leaned back in his plush leather chair and crossed his arms over his chest. "Suit yourself," he muttered, "but do not expect a single handout when this is over. We are done carrying dead weight." The heavy, toxic silence in the room was finally broken by Mr. Kensington clearing his throat. The elderly lawyer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking deeply uncomfortable with the tension radiating across the table. He had been my grandfather's confidant for decades, and he knew exactly how ruthless my father could be. With a steady hand, he opened the thick leather folder, smoothing out the crisp watermarked pages of my grandfather's primary will. "If we are all ready," Mr. Kensington began, his voice solemn and carrying the weight of a lifetime of legal authority. "We will proceed with the reading of the last will and testament of Harrison." My father sat up straighter, a triumphant gleam in his eye, entirely prepared to claim his kingdom. He smoothed his tie, a smug smile playing on his lips as he prepared to inherit everything he believed he was owed. And as the lawyer began to read the main document detailing the immediate distribution of the vast estate's properties and cash accounts, every single word seemed to validate my father's suffocating arrogance. Mr. Kensington cleared his throat again, the sound dry and formal against the backdrop of the ticking grandfather clock. He began with the smaller liquid assets, reading off account numbers and distribution percentages that I knew my father had already calculated in his head months ago. The room was practically vibrating with my family's greed. To my granddaughter Amanda, Mr. Kensington read, his voice steady and neutral. "I leave the lakeside estate in Coeur d'Alene, along with the $2 million upkeep trust associated with the property." Amanda let out a dramatic, breathy sigh of relief, placing a meticulously manicured hand over her chest. She looked across the table at me, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. She had always coveted that house. It was where we spent our summers growing up, and she had spent the last 5 years complaining at every holiday dinner that grandfather would not let her remodel the kitchen to fit her modern, minimalist aesthetic. Now she was already mentally knocking down walls. She leaned back, tapping away on her phone, undoubtedly texting her architect husband Jamal the good news. Mr. Kensington turned the heavy parchment page. "To my daughter-in-law Patricia, I leave the sum of $4 million held in a private trust in gratitude for her years of managing the family's social affairs." My mother dabbed the corner of her perfectly dry eye with a tissue. She nodded gracefully, playing the part of the grieving but grateful widow to perfection, even though it was her father-in-law who had passed. I watched her posture relax, her mind instantly, calculating how many charity galas, designer wardrobes, and country club luncheons that cash would fund. She leaned over to my father, whispering something about finally upgrading their yacht for the summer season. Then came the centerpiece, the crown jewel of Grandfather Harrison's legacy. The moment my father had been waiting for since I was a little girl. Mr. Kensington adjusted his glasses. "To my son Richard, I leave 100% operational control, the title of Chief Executive Officer, and all associated voting shares of Harrison Commercial Development." My father let out a long, slow breath. His shoulders dropped, the tension completely leaving his body. He ran his hands flat over the mahogany table, as if claiming the physical space of the room itself. He looked like a man who had just conquered a nation. For years he had operated as the face of the company, taking all the credit for the towering office buildings and luxury retail spaces the firm built. But grandfather had always kept him on a tight leash, refusing to hand over total legal control. My father hated him for it. Now the leash was gone. Richard was finally the undisputed king of the empire. The room erupted into a quiet, smug celebration. My father patted my mother's hand, his chest puffed out with absolute triumph. He shot me a look of pure, unfiltered arrogance. In his mind, he had won the ultimate game. He had secured the wealth, the status, and the power he believed was his divine right. The atmosphere shifted from tense anticipation to absolute suffocating entitlement. They had won. The social hierarchy of our family was permanently cemented in legal ink, and I was officially cast out into the cold. Amanda leaned across the table, invading my personal space. The heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me, making my stomach turn. She shielded her mouth with her hand, leaning in close. "You know, Claire," she whispered, her voice low enough so the lawyer would not hear, but loud enough for our parents to catch the tone. "If you had just tried a little harder to be part of this family, maybe grandfather would have remembered you were alive. You could have had a slice of the pie, a vacation home, a trust fund. But you always had to be so difficult and independent. I guess that $100 bill Dad gave you will have to cover your groceries for the week. Try not to spend it all in one place." My mother chuckled softly under her breath, a cruel, elegant little sound. My father did not even bother looking at me anymore. He was busy straightening his tie, preparing to leave the office as a titan of industry. I did not blink. I did not shift in my leather chair. I simply let her words hang in the air, a pathetic echo of the bullying she had practiced since we were children. She wanted me to cry. She wanted my voice to shake. My father wanted me to storm out of the office in a fit of jealous rage so he could point his finger, call me unstable, and justify his lifelong narrative that I was the broken, ungrateful child. They thrived on my visible pain. It was the currency they traded in. But I offered them absolutely nothing. My face was a mask of cold, calculated indifference. Decades of observing their financial and emotional manipulation had trained me perfectly for this exact moment. As a forensic accountant, I knew that the loudest people in the room were usually the most vulnerable. Instead of engaging with my sister's toxic taunts, instead of defending my career or my worth, I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the far end of the long conference table. My family was so busy celebrating their newly inherited wealth, so busy planning their renovations and yacht upgrades, that they failed to notice the most important detail in the entire room. Mr. Kensington had stopped reading, but his hands were not moving to pack up his briefcase. He had not closed the thick leather binder. He had not taken off his reading glasses. He was just sitting there in perfect disciplined silence, waiting for the murmurs of their petty celebration to die down. His eyes flicked up from the parchment and met mine for a brief, almost imperceptible second. A silent, heavy understanding passed between us. The main will was finished. They had received exactly what grandfather wanted them to believe they owned. But the meeting was not over. The quiet chatter in the room slowly died down as my family finally noticed Mr. Kensington. My father frowned, clearly annoyed that his victory lap was being delayed by a man he viewed as nothing more than hired help. He tapped his heavy gold watch, letting out a sharp, dramatic sigh. "Is there a problem, Kensington?" my father asked. "We have a lot of arrangements to make today, and I would like to get over to the corporate office to address my board of directors." Mr. Kensington reached into the very back of his worn leather briefcase. He did not pull out another standard legal form. Instead, he withdrew a thick, heavy ivory envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax and stamped with my grandfather's personal crest. "There is one final document," Mr. Kensington announced, his voice suddenly much sharper and commanding. "It is a legally binding, irrevocable codicil drafted entirely separate from the primary will, and it is directed solely to Claire." Amanda rolled her eyes dramatically, crossing her arms. "Oh, let me guess. Grandpa left her his vintage stamp collection, so she has something to do on Friday nights." My mother let out a sharp little laugh, adjusting her posture. "Just give her the sentimental junk so we can get out of here, Richard," she said dismissively. I did not take the bait. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy ivory envelope. Mr. Kensington broke the wax seal. The crisp snap of the wax echoed loudly in the quiet room. He unfolded the thick parchment, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. "I, Harrison, being of sound mind, do hereby enact this final and overriding codicil." Kensington read aloud, his voice projecting across the mahogany table. "To my granddaughter Claire, I leave the entirety of my private shares in Harrison Holdings." My father's face contorted in immediate confusion. "Harrison Holdings," he repeated, shaking his head. What is he talking about? There is no Harrison Holdings. My firm is Harrison Commercial Development. He is confused. He was old and his mind was going. Mr. Kensington looked up, meeting my father's arrogant gaze with absolute steel. Harrison Holdings is the private umbrella corporation your father established 40 years ago. It is the entity that holds the physical deed to every single square foot of land your commercial buildings currently sit on. And according to this document, Claire has just inherited 51% controlling interest of that corporation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My mother stopped smiling. Amanda lowered her phone, her mouth falling slightly open. My father gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning instantly white. Furthermore, Kensington continued, his voice rising over my father's sudden, heavy breathing. Claire is hereby named the sole legal executor of the entire Harrison estate. All immediate distributions, including the cash trusts, the summer property deeds, and the operational handover of the commercial firm previously mentioned, must undergo a full financial audit. They must receive Claire's direct legal authorization before a single cent is released to anyone in this room. The room froze completely. The smug, suffocating entitlement that had filled the air just moments ago evaporated into thin air. My father had thought he was the undisputed king. He thought he had inherited a sprawling empire. But my grandfather had just handed me the keys to the castle, the literal ground the castle was built on, and the leash tied directly to my father's neck. I sat perfectly still, my mind racing, as my professional training immediately kicked in. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what being the sole executor meant. It meant I had unrestricted legal access to every ledger, every bank account, and every hidden transaction my father had ever made under the guise of the family business. My grandfather had not just given me wealth, he had given me a loaded gun and pointed it directly at my father's financial secrets. And judging by the absolute panic radiating from my father's sweating face, those secrets were massive. The dead pale panic finally broke through my father's confident facade. That is impossible, he roared, his voice cracking as he slammed his fist onto the table. The crystal water glasses rattled violently. He was out of his mind. She manipulated him. She spent time with him just to brainwash him. Let me see that paper. My father lunged across the table, his face red with sudden violent rage, his hand desperately reaching for the codicil. Mr. Kensington reacted with shocking speed for a man his age. He snatched the document back and slammed his heavy leather folder shut, physically blocking my father's grasp. Sit down, Richard Kensington barked, his voice echoing with undeniable legal authority. This is a federally binding legal document. If you attempt to seize or destroy it, I will have you arrested for tampering with an estate before you can even make it to the lobby. My father froze, hovering over the table, his chest heaving as he stared down at the lawyer. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. He really looked at me for the very first time in my entire life. The condescension in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He realized in that split second that he did not own his empire. I owned him. Amanda practically leaped out of her chair, her voice shrill and panicked. She cannot be the executor. She does not even like us. Mom, tell him she cannot do this. My mother was too stunned to speak. Patricia's perfectly painted lips were parted in shock, her eyes darting between me and my father, as she realized her entire luxurious future suddenly hinged on the daughter she had spent decades treating like garbage. The balance of power had just violently shifted. I slowly stood up from my leather chair. I did not raise my voice because true power never needs to shout. I looked down at the $100 bill my father had thrown at me earlier. I picked it up, folded it neatly, and tossed it back across the long mahogany table. It landed perfectly in front of his trembling hands. Keep it. Richard, I said smoothly, picking up my purse. It looks like you are going to need every penny. I did not wait for my father to respond. I turned on my heel and walked out of the mahogany-paneled office, the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock fading behind me. I walked straight to the elevator bank, pressing the down button with a steady hand. I could hear the immediate eruption of chaos inside the conference room the moment the heavy door shut. My father shouting obscenities while my mother tried to shush him. The elevator arrived with a soft ping, and I stepped inside, watching the polished metal doors slide closed completely, severing me from their toxic presence. But I knew it would not be that easy. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the damp gray Seattle afternoon, I heard them. The frantic, aggressive footsteps of my family scrambling out of the building to hunt me down. The cool Pacific Northwest air hit my face, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the legal office, but it offered no relief. I kept my pace deliberate, and even the heels of my sensible shoes clicking rhythmically against the wet pavement as I headed toward my car. Before I could even reach into my purse for my keys, a heavy hand slammed down violently onto the hood of my 5-year-old sedan. Richard had practically sprinted across the parking lot to cut me off. He planted his imposing broad frame directly in front of my driver's side door, physically blocking my only exit. His chest was heaving under his expensive custom-tailored suit jacket. His face was a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck were visibly throbbing. This was the terrifying posture he used to dominate boardrooms and bully local politicians. "You are not going anywhere, Claire," he snarled, his voice echoing sharply across the concrete lot, drawing the attention of a few passing pedestrians. "Do you honestly think you are going to get away with this little stunt? You manipulated a dying old man. You spent the last 6 months visiting him just to poison his mind against his own son and steal what rightfully belongs to me." My mother and sister arrived seconds later, both of them gasping for breath. Patricia looked entirely unhinged, her usually flawless country club composure completely shattered. Her designer silk scarf was slipping off her shoulder, and she pointed a shaking manicured finger right at my face. "How could you do this to your own family, Claire?" she cried, her voice hitting a shrill, hysterical pitch that I had not heard since I was a teenager. "After everything we have done for you, after we put a roof over your head and fed you, you are a deceitful, ungrateful child. You are humiliating us in front of Mr. Kensington." Amanda stood slightly behind her, frantically typing away on her smartphone. She was probably already spinning a twisted victim narrative to her husband Jamal, preparing the groundwork to make me look like a monster. "I cannot believe you are doing this to me," Amanda whined, looking up from her screen with fake tears pooling in her eyes. "I am supposed to be planning my summer home renovations today, and instead I have to deal with your pathetic jealousy. You have always been so jealous of me." "I need a pen," Richard barked, looking wildly between my mother and sister, completely ignoring Amanda's complaints. "Give me a pen and some paper right now." He turned his furious gaze back to me, slamming his fist onto the roof of my car this time. "You are going to draft a formal renunciation of executorship right here, right now, Claire. You are going to sign away this ridiculous fantasy, and we are going to march back up to that office and fix this mess. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Commercial Development, and I will not be audited by a spiteful little desk jockey who barely makes $50,000 a year. If you do not sign it, I will personally call the partners at your accounting firm and tell them you are mentally unstable. I will ruin your miserable little career." I stood perfectly still, clutching my purse, observing him with the clinical, icy detachment of a scientist watching a rat navigate a maze. This was the man who had terrified me for 34 years, the man who dictated the emotional weather of our entire household. But looking at him now, pounding his fists against a mid-sized sedan in a public parking lot, threatening to call my bosses like a schoolyard bully, he did not look powerful at all. He looked incredibly weak. More importantly, my professional instincts were screaming at me. As a senior forensic accountant, I knew exactly what absolute panic looked like. Innocent business owners who are simply annoyed by a sudden audit roll their eyes and hand over the paperwork. But business owners who threaten, scream, and demand immediate legal renunciations in parking lots are terrified. They are terrified because they are hiding massive financial skeletons. Richard was not just angry about losing his title. He had just realized the one person holding the flashlight to his shadow ledgers was the daughter he had spent decades treating like garbage. "Step aside, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely void of the fear he was desperately trying to provoke. He did not move. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and held it up between us, my thumb hovering deliberately over the screen. "I am going to count to 3, I told him, looking him dead in his furious eyes. "If you do not step away from my vehicle, I am dialing 911 and reporting an attempted physical assault by a hostile individual. Considering your desperate need to maintain your high-profile social image, I imagine the police sirens and a public arrest record will not look great for your upcoming board meeting." For a split second, I saw absolute, unfiltered hatred flash across his face. He wanted to break me right there on the concrete. But his obsession with his public reputation won the internal battle. He took a slow, trembling step back, sneering at me like I was something disgusting he had scraped off the bottom of his shoe. I slipped past him without breaking eye contact, opened my heavy car door, and slid into the driver's seat. The moment the door shut, I immediately hit the lock button. The satisfying mechanical click echoed inside the quiet cabin of my car, sealing me inside my safe haven. I started the engine, the familiar hum grounding my nerves. Richard leaned down, pressing his face dangerously close to the glass, his angry breath fogging up the window. I reached out and pressed the automatic button, rolling the window down exactly 1 inch. Just enough for him to hear me clearly, but not enough for him to reach his hand inside. "You can throw all the temper tantrums you want," I said, my tone completely flat and professional. "But the codicil is legally binding and the financial audit is mandatory by federal law. You have exactly 30 days to submit the firm's complete expense reports, offshore tax filings, and internal corporate ledgers to my office for review. Do not be late, Richard. I heavily penalize for tardiness." I rolled the window back up neatly, cutting off whatever enraged guttural scream was tearing out of his throat. I shifted the car into drive and pulled smoothly out of the parking space, leaving my father standing helplessly in the damp concrete lot, his perfect, carefully constructed empire beginning to crumble around his expensive Italian leather shoes. As I merged onto the busy main street, my heart finally began to pound violently against my ribs. My hands shook slightly on the steering wheel. I had done it. I had drawn the first real boundary of my entire life. I had stood up to the monsters in my closet and walked away, but the feeling of victory was painfully short-lived. Just as I stopped at a red light, my phone resting in the center cup holder suddenly lit up and buzzed violently against the plastic. I glanced down at the glowing screen. It was an emergency group text from my mother, typed almost entirely in frantic capital letters. It demanded my immediate presence at a mandatory family intervention dinner this coming weekend, insisting we sit down like adults to fix my catastrophic mistake before it destroyed our family forever. I stared at the message as the traffic light turned green. The parking lot was just a skirmish. The real war had only just begun. For the next 3 days, my phone did not stop ringing. My mother sent a relentless barrage of text messages, oscillating wildly between furious demands and pitiful guilt trips. She claimed my father was experiencing chest pains from the stress, that my sister was entirely inconsolable, and that I was selfishly tearing the delicate fabric of our family apart. Finally, she deployed her ultimate emotional weapon, begging me to just come to a family dinner to keep the peace. She promised it would be neutral ground, a highly public and very expensive Italian restaurant downtown, where we could just sit down and talk like mature adults. I knew it was a trap. My family never did anything just to talk. Every interaction was a calculated chess move. But as the newly appointed legal executor of the Harrison estate, I also knew I could not simply hide in my apartment. If I was going to dismantle my father's empire and audit his corrupted company, I needed to look them in the eye and see exactly what kind of desperate strategy they were preparing to use against me. I arrived at the restaurant exactly on time. The place was bustling with Friday night energy, the air heavy with the rich scent of roasted garlic, truffle oil, and expensive red wine. The lighting was incredibly dim, creating an atmosphere of forced intimacy. The host led me past tables of laughing couples and celebrating executives, guiding me toward a large, secluded booth in the very back corner of the dining room. They were already waiting for me. My father Richard sat on the outside edge of the curved leather booth with a stiff, furious posture. He was nursing a glass of dark amber scotch, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching under his skin. Next to him sat my mother Patricia, wearing a forced, impossibly tight smile and a string of pearls that probably cost more than my car. Across from them sat my sister Amanda, and beside her was her husband Jamal. Jamal was a successful commercial architect, a kind, principled, and hard-working man who had always been surprisingly decent to me at family gatherings. Despite Amanda's constant snide remarks and my parents' blatant favoritism, Jamal had always made an effort to ask me about my day, treat my career with actual respect, and bring a sense of grounded reality to our chaotic holiday dinners. He offered me a warm, albeit incredibly tense smile as I slid into the empty chair across the table from him. The pleasantries lasted exactly until the waiter poured my sparkling water, set down a basket of warm artisan bread, and walked away. The moment he was out of earshot, the polite masks dropped, and the psychological ambush immediately began. Richard leaned across the table, his massive shoulders hunched aggressively as he completely ignored the leather-bound menu in front of him. "You have had 3 days to let your little power trip run its course, Claire," he sneered, keeping his voice low and venomous to avoid causing a scene in front of the other wealthy patrons. "Have you come to your senses yet, or are you really going to force me to drag you into family court and expose you to a judge? I have lawyers who will tear that ridiculous codicil to shreds and bury you in legal fees until you are bankrupt." My mother immediately chimed in, perfectly executing her role as the distressed peacemaker. She placed a dramatic, trembling hand over her heart and leaned toward me. "Claire, please look at what you are doing to your father. Just sign the renunciation paperwork and let us go back to normal. Your father has not slept in days. Amanda is absolutely terrified about her future. Why are you punishing us for your grandfather's confused and deteriorating state of mind? You know he was not thinking clearly at the end." Amanda jumped in right on cue, flawlessly picking up the rhythm of their tag team assault. She reached out and grabbed Jamal's arm, pressing herself against his shoulder like a frightened, fragile bird hiding from a predator. "It is not just about the family business," Claire Amanda said, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured tears that glistened in the dim restaurant lighting. "It is about my actual life, my marriage, my security. How can you be so incredibly cold and selfish after everything Mom and Dad have done for you?" I did not take the bait. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, observing their synchronized performance with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor examining a forged receipt. They were trying to overwhelm me with guilt, fear, and public pressure. But my eyes drifted away from my raging father and my weeping sister and landed directly on Jamal. Jamal was not looking at me with anger or malice. His dark brown eyes were filled with genuine, profound confusion and deep disappointment. His brow was heavily furrowed and his jaw was set tight. He gently patted Amanda's trembling hand, offering her silent comfort, before leaning forward and resting his forearms on the white tablecloth. He looked right into my eyes, his calm, steady presence completely contrasting the hysterical, toxic energy vibrating from my parents and sister. Claire Jamal started his tone deeply earnest and heavy with concern. "I have always respected you. I have always thought you were incredibly smart and level-headed. I know you and Amanda have your differences, and I know Richard can be a very hard man to deal with when it comes to business. But family is family. I just do not understand why you would go this far to hurt your own sister." I stared at him, keeping my expression entirely neutral, though my mind immediately went on high alert. "Go how far, Jamal?" I asked, simply keeping my voice soft and measured. Jamal let out a long, heavy sigh, looking incredibly burdened by the entire situation. He glanced down at Amanda, who buried her face deeper into his tailored suit jacket, letting out a soft, theatrical sob. Jamal looked back at me, his expression hardening slightly with protective instincts. Amanda says you are using some hidden legal loophole in your grandfather's will to seize all the private family assets and evict us from our home, Jamal said, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. She says you are freezing our bank accounts and trying to force a sale of the house out of spite. Is that true, Claire? Are you really trying to throw my wife and me out onto the street just to get back at your father? The heavy words hung in the air over the untouched basket of bread. I did not immediately respond. My mind was racing rapidly, sorting through the data, putting the psychological pieces together. I looked at Amanda. She slowly peeked out from behind Jamal's shoulder. For a fraction of a second, the fake tears vanished, and she shot me a look of pure, terrified, desperate warning. It hit me like a freight train. Jamal had absolutely no idea what was actually happening. Amanda had not told him the truth about the will reading. She had not mentioned the secret holding company, my grandfather's deliberate appointment of me as the legal executor, or the mandatory federal financial audit I had ordered. She knew that if she told Jamal the truth, his sharp mind and strong moral compass would immediately question why my father was so terrified of a simple accounting review. Instead, my sister had gone home and spun a completely fabricated, hysterical narrative. She had painted me as a greedy, unhinged monster who was exploiting an old man's dementia to steal her house. She had deliberately weaponized her husband's protective nature, feeding him a diet of pure lies, so he would come to this dinner and act as her emotional shield. Jamal was an innocent bystander, completely clueless about the massive financial fraud and the crumbling reality of the Harrison family empire. And looking at my sister's pale, panicked face, I realized she had just made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation by bringing him to this dinner and putting him directly in the line of fire. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my sister, whose eyes were currently wide with the sudden realization that she had played the absolute wrong card. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Jamal. The poor man was a brilliant architect, meticulous with blueprints and structural integrity, completely unaware that his own financial foundation was built on a massive hidden sinkhole. He was looking at me with such genuine concern, entirely convinced that his wife was the victim of a cruel, jealous sister. Jamal, I said, keeping my voice incredibly even and projecting the calm, authoritative tone I used in high-stakes corporate boardrooms. I am not evicting you. I have absolutely no interest in your house, and I have not frozen your personal bank accounts. Jamal blinked, his brow furrowing deeper. Then why did Amanda say you were coming after our home? She has been crying for 3 days straight, Claire. I cut him off gently. Amanda is terrified of the estate audit, Jamal. But not because of me. She is terrified because of what the audit will inevitably reveal to you. I leaned back in my leather chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. The restaurant around us continued to hum with the clinking of wine glasses and soft jazz, entirely oblivious to the bomb I was about to detonate at our table. The house you live in is technically solely in Amanda's name, I explained clearly, making sure every word landed with absolute precision. It was an early wedding gift from my grandfather, transferred right before you two were officially married. Because her name is the only one on the primary deed, she has certain unilateral liberties. Did she mention to you that she took out a $400,000 secondary mortgage on that property last October? Jamal physically recoiled. He looked like I had just reached across the table and slapped him across the face. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. He turned his head slowly to look at his wife. Amanda had gone completely ashen. The theatrical manufactured tears had vanished instantly, replaced by raw, suffocating panic. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly and terrified under the dim restaurant lights. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless squeak came out. She looked frantically at our parents for salvation. My father slammed his heavy hand down onto the table. The silverware clattered violently against the porcelain plates, and several people at the adjacent tables turned their heads to stare. "Shut your mouth right now, Claire," Richard hissed. his face turning a dangerous explosive shade of purple. He leaned halfway across the table, invading my space, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and desperation. "This is private family business. You have absolutely no right to discuss these matters in public, and you certainly have no right to interfere in your sister's marriage." "I am the legal executor of the estate, Richard," I replied, coldly, not backing away an inch. "Every single cent of your financial fraud is now my business." I turned my attention back to Jamal, who was staring at his wife in absolute horror. Jamal was an honest man who worked 70-hour weeks to build a life for his family. He paid his taxes, he paid his mortgage, and he trusted the woman he slept next to every night. "She forged your signature as a consenting spouse on the secondary loan documents, Jamal." I continued, my voice steady, delivering the facts, like a judge reading a verdict. "She took out $400,000 in equity on your shared home, and she did not use it for renovations. She wired the entire sum directly into one of my father's hidden holding companies to quietly cover a massive deficit in one of his failing commercial real estate developments. My father was facing a margin call, and he used your wife to steal the equity right out from under your feet." The booth imploded. Jamal stood up so fast that his heavy crystal water glass tipped over. The ice water spilled across the white tablecloth and dripped onto Amanda's designer dress, but she did not even flinch. Jamal did not shout. He did not make a scene, but the sheer, furious intensity radiating from his tall frame was terrifying. "Look at me, Amanda," Jamal demanded, his voice dropping an octave, shaking with a mixture of rage and profound heartbreak. "Look me in the eye right now and tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not forge my name and put our home in debt to bail out your father." Amanda covered her face with her hands and burst into genuine hysterical sobs. She shrank back into the booth, hyperventilating, crying out for our mother to do something. Patricia was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly I thought the string might snap, whispering frantically to Richard to fix the situation. But Richard was powerless. He was practically foaming at the mouth, pointing a shaking finger at me and sputtering incoherent threats that were completely drowned out by the chaos of the unraveling marriage right next to him. I did not stick around to watch the rest of the carnage. I had delivered the truth, and the poison of their own lies was doing the rest of the work. I calmly raised my hand and signaled our waiter, who had been hovering nervously near the kitchen doors, clearly unsure if he should approach the disaster zone of our table. When he cautiously stepped forward, keeping a safe distance from my furious father, I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet. My family had always mocked my salary. They thought I was a pathetic desk clerk barely scraping by. They had no idea that senior forensic accountants who untangled multi-million-dollar corporate fraud cases were compensated incredibly well for their discretion and expertise. I pulled a sleek, heavy titanium black card from my wallet and placed it gently on the dry edge of the tablecloth. "Please charge my sparkling water and the artisan bread basket to this card," I instructed the waiter politely, offering him a small, apologetic smile. "The rest of the party will be handling their own tab tonight." The waiter quickly grabbed the card and scurried away. I stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in my tailored coat. I slung my purse over my shoulder and looked down at my family. It was a pathetic sight. Jamal was demanding the car keys from a weeping Amanda, clearly intending to leave her stranded at the restaurant. My mother was trying to dab the spilled water off Amanda's lap with a napkin, and my father was glaring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. 30 days, Richard," I reminded him softly over the noise of the crowded restaurant. "The clock is ticking on those ledgers." I turned and walked away from the booth, my head held high, leaving them scrambling in the absolute wreckage of their own deceit. I walked out of the elegant dining room, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The city streets were alive with traffic and chatter. I took a deep breath, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had finally fought back. I had dropped a match on the bridge and watched it burn. But as I walked toward my car, a deep, unsettling chill settled into my bones. Richard was completely cornered now. I had exposed his secret bailout and destroyed his golden child's marriage in one calculated move. I knew my father better than anyone. Cornered animals do not just surrender, they lash out with everything they have. I knew Richard would not let this go, and the real retaliation was about to begin. I spent the rest of the weekend entirely off the grid. I ignored the frantic voicemails from my mother and the completely silent absence of my sister. By Monday morning, I was ready to officially dismantle my father's financial fortress. I dressed in a sharp navy blue tailored suit, pulled my hair back into a severe bun, and gathered my heavy leather briefcase containing the legally binding codicil and my federal identification. The crisp morning air in downtown Seattle felt electric. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was the sole legal executor of the Harrison estate, and I was going to work. I arrived at the towering glass and steel building of Pacific Cascade Bank precisely at 9 o'clock. This was the institution that handled the primary accounts for Harrison Holdings. I bypassed the standard teller lines and walked directly to the private wealth management wing on the 4th floor. The air up there smelled of expensive espresso and polished mahogany. I approached the reception desk and asked for Mr. Abernathy, the senior branch manager who had personally handled my grandfather's private accounts for over a decade. Within minutes, I was ushered into his spacious corner office overlooking the Puget Sound. Mr. Abernathy was a meticulous man in his late 50s, usually armed with a warm smile and a firm handshake. But today, as I walked through his door, he did not smile. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his hands clasped tightly together on his pristine glass desk. The heavy silence in his office was an immediate red flag to my professional instincts. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," I said, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite him. I placed my briefcase on the desk and unclasped it. "I assume you received the scanned copies of my grandfather's codicil from Mr. Kensington's office on Friday afternoon. I am here to officially assume my duties as the executor of Harrison Holdings and initiate a full freeze on all outgoing transfers from the commercial development accounts." Mr. Abernathy sighed heavily, removing his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Claire, I did receive the documents from Kensington, and under normal circumstances I would be handing you the master access tokens right now. But as of 8 o'clock this morning, my hands are completely tied by a federal court order." I stopped unzipping my briefcase. I looked up at him, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "Explain that to me," I said evenly. He slid a thick blue legal folder across the glass desk toward me. "Your father Richard filed an emergency ex parte injunction with the family court judge first thing this morning. It is a temporary competency hold. He has formally petitioned to have you removed as executor on the grounds of severe mental instability." I stared at the blue folder. The audacity was almost breathtaking. "Mentally unstable," I repeated, my voice flat. "On what medical grounds exactly?" Mr. Abernathy opened the folder and pointed to a signed affidavit. He provided a sworn statement from Dr. Weber, your parents' private physician. "The affidavit claims that the grief of losing your grandfather, combined with the stress of your demanding job, has triggered a severe psychological break. Dr. Weber states that you exhibited erratic, hostile, and delusional behavior in a public setting just this past Friday night. He is legally recommending a full psychiatric evaluation before you are allowed to make any financial decisions regarding an estate of this magnitude." A cold, sharp wave of realization washed over me. The restaurant. My father had not just been throwing a temper tantrum when I exposed Amanda's fraud to Jamal. He had been baiting me. He orchestrated a highly public confrontation, ensured there were witnesses to the chaos, and then immediately weaponized the fallout. He had called Dr. Weber a sleazy country club doctor who owed my father countless favors and probably free rounds of golf to rubber stamp a fraudulent medical document. It was the ultimate narcissistic power play. If you cannot defeat the truth, you simply declare the truth-teller completely insane. "So what does this mean for the accounts?" I asked, refusing to let Mr. Abernathy see a single ounce of panic. "It means the estate is in administrative limbo," he replied apologetically. Until a judge reviews the competency injunction and you pass an independent psychological evaluation, I am legally barred from granting you access to the Harrison Holdings ledgers. The accounts are frozen. You cannot see the ledgers, you cannot authorize audits, and you cannot stop your father from running the commercial side of the business as he sees fit. I am so sorry, Claire. But legally, I have to comply with the court order. I closed my briefcase with a sharp, decisive click. I did not argue with the bank manager. I knew better than to shoot the messenger. Mr. Abernathy was just a man following the law, unaware that the law was currently being manipulated by a desperate criminal. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Abernathy," I said smoothly, standing up and smoothing my suit jacket. "I will have my lawyers address this immediately." I walked out of the bank with the same measured, confident stride I used when I walked in, but inside my mind was running complex risk assessments. My father had successfully blockaded the front door. He bought himself time to shred documents, time to move offshore funds, time to cover up the massive financial sinkhole he had dug for his company. Fighting a competency injunction in family court could take months. They would drag it out, forcing me to undergo humiliating psychological tests, using my own family members to testify against my character. Just as I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the bank and stepped onto the busy sidewalk, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Richard. I stopped walking and stared at the screen. The message was short, arrogant, and dripping with malicious victory. "Checkmate," the text read. "Sign the renunciation today, or I will have Dr. Weber legally commit you to a psychiatric ward by the end of the week. Do not test me, Claire. You have no money, no access, and no family left. You lost." I stood on the bustling Seattle sidewalk, pedestrians rushing past me with their morning coffees. My father thought he had me backed into an inescapable corner. He thought he had completely disarmed me by locking the front door to the estate. But he fundamentally misunderstood what I did for a living. I did not need the bank's front door. I was a senior forensic accountant. My entire career was built on breaking in through the digital back windows that arrogant men like him always forgot to lock. I did not reply to his text. I simply locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I walked back to my car, my mind already pivoting to my secondary strategy. If Richard thought freezing the official accounts would hide his embezzlement, he was woefully ignorant of modern digital forensics. He was operating under the delusion that he controlled the narrative. But numbers do not care about country club doctors or family court drama. Numbers leave a permanent, undeniable trail. I unlocked my sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and took a deep breath. He wanted a war of attrition. He wanted to drag my name through the mud and label me crazy. Fine. Let him waste his energy playing legal games. I was going to use my own private resources to bypass the banking system entirely and dig straight into the shadow ledgers of his beloved company. By the time I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of my apartment building, my phone was vibrating so violently against the passenger seat that it was physically warm to the touch. I gathered my briefcase, locked my car, and rode the elevator up to my floor in complete silence, ignoring the relentless buzzing in my pocket. I knew exactly what was happening. Richard had fired his legal warning shot with the competency injunction, but that was just the bureaucratic side of his warfare. My family's true weapon of choice had always been public humiliation. I unlocked my front door, stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. I finally pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications. Missed calls, text messages from unsaved numbers, and a massive string of alerts from every social media platform I maintained a passive presence on. I opened the first message. It was a link sent by my cousin Brenda, accompanied by a text that simply read, "How could you be so evil?" I clicked the link. It redirected me instantly to Amanda's public profile page. She had posted a 10-minute video, and it had already racked up thousands of views and hundreds of comments. The thumbnail was a perfectly framed shot of my sister sitting on her plush cream-colored living room sofa, clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes red and puffy. I hit play, and Amanda's trembling, breathless voice filled my kitchen. I never thought I would have to make a video like this. Amanda began staring directly into the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes. She was wearing an oversized gray sweater, completely devoid of her usual heavy makeup, looking the absolute picture of vulnerability. But my family is being torn apart, and I have to protect my parents. As many of you know, we recently lost my grandfather. We are entirely heartbroken. But instead of grieving together, my older sister Claire has decided to use a manipulative legal loophole to try and destroy us. I watched mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of her performance. She dabbed her perfectly dry eyes and took a shuddering breath. Claire has always been distant. Amanda continued, her voice cracking right on cue. She never married. She pushed everyone away, and I guess living that kind of bitter, isolated life changes a person. But I never thought she would become this unhinged. She is trying to seize my grandfather's entire estate. She is trying to evict me and my husband from our home, and she is threatening to bankrupt our grieving father. She is trying to lock us out of our own family business just out of pure, greedy spite. The video cut to a montage of old family photos, deliberately selecting pictures where I was either absent or looking uncomfortable in the background while Amanda and my parents smiled brightly in the center. She painted a masterclass portrait of me as the resentful, unhinged spinster sister jealous of Amanda's perfect marriage and furious at my father's success. She begged her followers to pray for our family and asked for privacy while they dealt with my erratic, dangerous behavior. I scrolled down to the comments section. It was an absolute bloodbath. Extended relatives, family friends, and complete strangers were sharpening their pitchforks. My Aunt Susan had commented that she always knew I was a rotten apple. An old high school friend of Amanda's wrote that I needed to be locked in a psychiatric ward before I hurt somebody. My phone chimed again, with a text from my Uncle David calling me a greedy disgrace to the Harrison name. Watching my sister lower her tissue and look tragically into the camera lens, I felt a sharp, intense wave of déjà vu. It was the exact same theatrical performance she used to give when we were teenagers, just broadcasted to a much larger audience. I vividly remembered a Sunday afternoon when I was 16 years old. My grandmother had given me a beautiful, delicate silver locket for my birthday. I cherished it, keeping it polished and safe in my top drawer. A week later, it vanished. I spent 2 days frantically tearing my room apart before I finally found it deliberately buried at the bottom of Amanda's velvet jewelry box. When I marched into her room and confronted her with the stolen necklace in my hand, she did not apologize. Instead, she immediately burst into hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. She ran downstairs to our parents, collapsing onto the living room rug, wailing that I had carelessly lost the locket myself, and was now trying to frame her to cover up my own stupid irresponsibility. I had stood there holding the proof of her theft, thinking the truth would be enough. But my mother had rushed forward, wrapping her arms around a weeping Amanda, shushing her gently. My father had turned to me with a face full of disgust, grounding me for a month for being a malicious liar. Amanda had peeked over my mother's shoulder and flashed me a tiny, triumphant smirk. She had learned very early on that if you cry loud enough and play the perfect victim, you can get away with absolutely anything. Now, 15 years later, she was running the exact same play. She was using her tears as a shield to cover up the fact that she had stolen $400,000 in equity from her own husband. She and Richard had clearly coordinated this strike. File the fake competency injunction to lock me out of the bank, and simultaneously launch a vicious public smear campaign to destroy my credibility. If I tried to defend myself and tell the truth about their financial crimes, now I would just look exactly like the crazy, jealous, vindictive sister they were portraying me to be. They expected me to crack. They expected the weight of the public hatred, the hateful text messages, and the social isolation to break my spirit. They thought I would panic, record my own frantic defensive video, or better yet, call my father in tears, begging for mercy and offering to sign the renunciation just to make the bullying stop. I stared at the paused frame of Amanda's tragic tear-stained face on my phone screen. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to defend myself to aunts and uncles who only cared about country club gossip. I felt a cold, hyper-focused clarity settle deep into my chest. I walked into my kitchen, opened a drawer, and dropped my vibrating smartphone inside. I pushed the drawer shut instantly, muffling the endless stream of notifications. I did not type out a single response. I did not answer a single call. Instead, I walked down the short hallway to my spare bedroom. I had converted this space into a state-of-the-art home office the day I was promoted to senior forensic accountant. I closed the heavy blackout curtains, plunging the room into shadows, and locked the solid wooden door behind me. I sat down in my ergonomic mesh chair and pressed the power button on my massive custom-built desktop tower. I did not boot into the standard operating system. I bypassed the conventional startup and booted directly into a heavily encrypted partitioned hard drive. The dual ultra-wide monitors flared to life, casting a sharp, cool blue light across my face. Let them have their little social media circus. Let them bask in the fake sympathy and the fabricated victimhood. My family was busy fighting a public relations war, entirely oblivious to the fact that I was about to wage a digital one. I cracked my knuckles watching the heavy-duty decryption software load onto my screens. They had locked the front doors to the bank, but I was about to tear the walls of their entire financial house down straight to the foundation. The heavy-duty decryption software finished its boot sequence, and my dual monitors split into a highly organized grid of secure databases, financial modeling programs, and encrypted communication channels. The chaotic noise of my family's public smear campaign was safely locked away in the kitchen drawer. In this room, there were no fake tears, no manipulative guilt trips, and no hysterical accusations. There was only data. And data is completely immune to gaslighting. Richard thought that by filing a fraudulent competency injunction and freezing my access to the official estate accounts at Pacific Cascade Bank, he had successfully paralyzed me. He was operating under the archaic assumption that the only way to audit a company is to politely ask the bank for their printed ledgers. He did not understand that in the modern world of forensic accounting, the internal bank account is just the final chapter of the book. If you know how to read the public records, the tax filings, and the municipal supply chains, you can easily write the entire story yourself from the outside in. I pulled out my personal titanium credit card and began paying the exorbitant access fees for premium restricted corporate intelligence databases. These were the same proprietary tools my firm used to dismantle corrupt hedge funds and trace money laundering cartels. I bypassed the frozen estate accounts entirely and used my own private funds to launch the investigation. Every swipe of the card was an investment in my own sanity and my grandfather's legacy. I started with the foundation. Harrison Commercial Development was a massive entity responsible for building luxury shopping centers and high-end corporate parks across the Pacific Northwest. While their private bank accounts were currently sealed behind a judge's order, their public footprint was massive. I began scraping municipal building permits, public tax assessments, and mandatory state-level corporate filings from the last 10 years. I fed thousands of pages of raw data into a specialized algorithm I had personally coded, designed to flag financial anomalies, inflated valuations, and suspicious vendor relationships. For the first 3 hours, the room was entirely silent, except for the rapid mechanical clacking of my keyboard and the soft hum of my desktop tower. I drank my coffee black, my eyes darting across the spreadsheets as the algorithm did its heavy lifting. To a normal person, it would just look like an endless, mind-numbing wall of numbers. But to me, it was a living, breathing ecosystem. I could see the pulse of the company, and very quickly I realized that the pulse was dangerously weak. The first major red flag appeared just before noon. I was reviewing the supply chain invoices for a massive luxury retail complex my father had built 4 years ago. The development had gone wildly over budget, a fact Richard had publicly blamed on supply chain issues and rising material costs. But as I cross-referenced the municipal construction permits with the registered vendor lists, I noticed a glaring discrepancy. Harrison Commercial Development had paid over $800,000 to a single materials procurement firm called Apex Global Solutions for specialized architectural steel. But when I pulled the international shipping manifests and local freight logs for that specific quarter, there was absolutely no record of any steel ever being delivered to the build site by that company. Furthermore, the structural engineering reports filed with the city showed that the steel actually used in the building was sourced from a completely different local supplier. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart rate beginning to pick up. The adrenaline of the hunt was kicking in. I opened a new secure tab and dug into the corporate registration of Apex Global Solutions. It was a limited liability company registered in Delaware, a state famous for its strict corporate secrecy laws that allow owners to remain entirely anonymous. But Delaware still requires a registered agent to handle legal correspondence. I paid another hefty fee to pull the historical charter documents for Apex Global. The registered agent was not a person. It was a generic post office box, located in a strip mall in Wilmington. I ran that specific post office box address through a global cross-referencing database to see what else was hiding inside it. The results populated instantly, and the sheer scale of the deception made my stomach drop. That single post office box was the registered address for 11 different shell companies. All of them had vague corporate-sounding names: Horizon Consulting Group, Summit Logistics, Blue Water Materials. I quickly wrote a script to bounce those 11 names against the public expenditure reports of Harrison Commercial Development over the last decade. My screens immediately lit up with dozens of matched hits. My father had been authorizing massive recurring payments to every single one of these phantom companies. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were flowing out of the main corporate accounts every quarter, labeled as consulting fees, procurement costs, and logistical management. But none of these companies had physical offices. None of them had employees. They had no web presence, no freight records, and no tangible products. They were black holes existing only on paper, designed specifically to swallow cash. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the cool blue light of the monitors reflecting off my face. The puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping together, forming a horrifying picture. Richard was not just a terrible businessman who made a few bad investments and needed a bailout from Amanda. He was a parasite. He was actively and systematically bleeding his own family empire dry. He was generating fake invoices from shell companies he secretly controlled, approving the payments as the chief executive officer, and funneling the cash completely out of the corporate ecosystem. He was taking the immense wealth my grandfather had built and burying it in untraceable offshore accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle and my mother's country club status, while simultaneously driving the actual company into severe debt. I opened a blank master spreadsheet and started aggregating the fraudulent invoices. I needed to know the exact depth of the wound. I typed furiously, pulling every fake transaction, every phantom consulting fee, and every inflated material cost I could find, tied to that Delaware post office box. The numbers cascaded down the screen in a long, damning column. $50,000 here, $200,000 there. The timeline stretched back almost 9 full years. I highlighted the entire column and clicked the autosum function. I held my breath as the software calculated the total deficit. When the final number flashed at the bottom of the screen, the air completely left my lungs. I took off my reading glasses and rubbed my eyes, staring at the bold black digits, just to make sure I was not hallucinating the decimal point. $6.2 million. This was not just bad management. This was not just a desperate man trying to cover a temporary margin call. This was a highly orchestrated multi-million-dollar federal crime. My father had stolen over $6 million right under my grandfather's nose. And suddenly his frantic, violent reaction in the parking lot made perfect sense. He was not trying to protect his pride. He was trying to stay out of federal prison. I sat in the glow of my monitors, the staggering figure of $6.2 million burning into my retinas. The sheer scale of my father's embezzlement was breathtaking. But as the initial shock began to subside, a new question immediately surfaced. How much did my grandfather actually know? Harrison was a sharp, uncompromising patriarch who built his empire from the ground up. It was incredibly difficult to believe that a man who scrutinized every cement invoice and architectural blueprint would simply fail to notice $6 million vanishing from his own corporate accounts over the span of a decade. I pushed my ergonomic chair back from the desk and walked over to my leather briefcase resting on the floor. I unclasped the heavy brass buckles and reached inside, pulling out the thick ivory envelope Mr. Kensington had handed me just a few days ago in his office. The dark red wax seal was already broken, the thick parchment of the irrevocable codicil folded neatly inside. I pulled the legal document out and laid it flat on my desk under the bright focused beam of my desk lamp. I had read the legal jargon a dozen times, memorizing the clauses that gave me total executive control. But I had been so intensely focused on the legal authority it granted me that I had completely glossed over the very bottom of the final page. Below Mr. Kensington's official notary stamp and my grandfather's elegant sweeping signature, there was a handwritten postscript. It was penned in my grandfather's distinct, shaky cursive. At first glance, it looked like a random string of letters and numbers, perhaps a reference code for the law firm's internal filing system. But as I leaned in closer, my breath hitched in my throat. It was not a filing code. It was a sequence of coordinates followed by an alphanumeric string formatted in a very specific, deeply familiar pattern. When I was 12 years old, while Amanda was out shopping with my mother, and my father was golfing with his corporate buddies, I used to sit quietly in my grandfather's expansive home study. He would give me complex logic puzzles and basic cryptographic ciphers to solve while he read the Financial Times. It was our secret game, a quiet acknowledgement of the analytical mind my parents so deeply despised. Looking at the handwritten postscript now 22 years later, I instantly recognized the structural formatting. It was a Vigenere cipher utilizing a specific keyword we had established during those quiet Sunday afternoons. The keyword was integrity. I grabbed a yellow legal pad and a pen from my drawer. My heart hammered against my ribs as I quickly wrote out the alphabet and began shifting the letters according to the master key. It took me less than 3 minutes to decode the entire string of text. When I finished, I stared at the translated characters. It was not a profound final quote or a sentimental family goodbye. It was a secure web address followed by a highly complex 16-character password. I turned back to my desktop computer. I opened a highly secure encrypted browser window and typed the exact web address into the navigation bar. A stark, minimalist login screen appeared against a black background asking for credentials. I carefully typed the decoded password, double-checking every single character before hitting the enter key. The screen went dark for a fraction of a second, and then a hidden encrypted cloud drive loaded onto my monitor. The digital drive was titled simply, The Ledger. I clicked into the primary root folder and my jaw tightened. The drive contained gigabytes of hidden data. There were hundreds of scanned documents, fuzzy photographs of old wire transfer receipts, and meticulous handwritten notes my grandfather had digitized. I opened the very first file, a scanned handwritten letter addressed directly to me. Claire. The letter began, written in his familiar, deteriorating hand. If you are reading this, it means you successfully decoded the postscript, and Kensington did his job. For the last 3 years, I have strongly suspected your father was stealing from the firm. I noticed the subtle discrepancies in the quarterly margins, the highly inflated budgets for construction materials that never actually arrived, and the sudden unexplainable cash flow shortages. I tried to track the money myself. I even hired private investigators to look into a company called Apex Global Solutions. But I am an old man. Claire. The letter continued. I do not understand modern digital banking, encrypted offshore accounts, or the complex web of digital shell companies Richard is using. I could see the smoke, but I completely lacked the technical skills to find the fire. I knew if I confronted Richard without absolute, undeniable, and court-admissible proof, he would use his aggressive legal team to bury me. He would claim I was senile, file a competency injunction against me, and accelerate his theft before I could stop him. He would destroy the company and leave the entire family destitute. "I am leaving this to you, Claire," my grandfather wrote, his ink pressing deeply into the scanned page. "You are the only one in this family with the intellect, the moral integrity, and the specific forensic accounting skills required to follow the money. I have gathered everything I could find physically in his office. The rest is entirely up to you. Tear his false empire down to the studs. Do not let him win." I closed the scanned letter, my eyes burning with a fierce, overwhelming sense of vindicating pride. My grandfather had seen me. He had always seen me exactly for who I was, while the rest of the family treated me like an invisible disappointment. He trusted me to be the executioner of his justice. I clicked back to the main directory of the cloud drive and began downloading the folders directly to my secure, partitioned hard drive. As the heavy progress bar slowly filled across my screen, I opened the subfolder labeled Offshore Entities. It was an absolute goldmine. My grandfather had managed to photograph Richard's private tax documents that he had carelessly left out in his home office years ago. The digital files contained the exact international routing numbers, the Cayman Island bank account credentials, and the registration deeds for every single shell company Richard had been using to bleed Harrison Commercial Development dry for over a decade. He had mapped out the exact Delaware post office box I had just discovered through my own algorithm. I did not just have my digital breadcrumbs anymore. I had the smoking gun, the bullets, and my father's fingerprints all perfectly preserved in one place. I sat back and began to cross-reference grandfather's captured documents with the public tax records I had already pulled. The scale of the parasitic drain on Harrison Commercial Development was absolutely astounding. My father was not building an empire at all. He was running a highly sophisticated, glorified Ponzi scheme. Every time a new commercial development project was greenlit by the board, he took out massive construction loans from major institutional banks. But instead of using those funds to pay the actual builders and secure the necessary materials, he funneled huge percentages of the cash directly into his Delaware shell companies. To keep the company afloat, he used the remaining funds to cut corners, barely finishing the physical structures. Then he heavily leveraged the newly finished, poorly constructed buildings to secure even more bank loans, using the new money to pay the minimum interest on the old debts. It was a vicious, unsustainable cycle of endless borrowing. The company was structurally bankrupt, propped up entirely by fresh debt and fabricated accounting ledgers. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were not just sitting dormant as a safety net. They were actively feeding my parents' suffocating need for high society dominance. I traced wire transfers directly from the phantom shell companies to luxury car dealerships, high-end jewelers, and exclusive European travel agencies. That massive diamond tennis bracelet my mother wore to the will reading was entirely paid for by a fake architectural consulting firm. Their entire life, their sprawling estate, their six-figure country club memberships, all of it was built on stolen corporate debt. My father was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and using the skimmed profits to buy Patricia a new yacht. As I dug deeper into the domestic payroll ledgers, looking for any other internal cash leaks, a highly recurring automated payment caught my eye. It was an executive salary disbursement hitting the corporate accounts on the 1st and 15th of every single month without fail. I pulled the corresponding internal tax forms and matched the routing numbers. The employee listed was Amanda. According to the official corporate ledger, my sister was employed as the Senior Director of Strategic Design Consulting. Her annual salary was a staggering $200,000. I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed in the quiet room. Amanda had never worked a day in her life. She spent her days attending boutique Pilates classes, hosting upscale brunches, and browsing expensive interior design showrooms. She was a phantom employee, She was receiving a massive corporate salary for a job that did not actually exist, complete with full luxury health benefits and an executive retirement matching package. It was a breathtaking family syndicate of fraud. My father was the mastermind. My mother was the primary beneficiary turning a blind eye, and my sister was a heavily subsidized accessory. This was exactly why they were so fiercely united against me. They were not just protecting their petty inheritances or their bruised egos. They were protecting a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. If a legitimate, legally appointed executor stepped in and audited the books, the gravy train would instantly derail, and they would all be exposed. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, pressing the palms of my hands against my tired eyes. I had everything I needed. I had the offshore routing numbers, the fake payroll stubs, the forged supply chain invoices, and the original notes from the founder of the company. I had enough concrete, irrefutable evidence to send Richard and Amanda to federal prison for a very long time and leave my mother completely destitute. But the cold, hard reality of the legal system immediately tempered my adrenaline. Evidence is only as good as the credibility of the person presenting it. And right now, legally speaking, my credibility had been effectively destroyed. I was not a senior forensic accountant in the eyes of the court. Thanks to my father's fraudulent ex parte filing, I was a mentally unstable, grieving daughter who was completely unfit to handle legal matters. If I marched into the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office today and dropped this hard drive on an agent's desk, Richard's high-priced defense attorneys would immediately produce the family court injunction. They would fiercely argue that the evidence was illegally obtained, completely fabricated by a disgruntled employee, or the result of a delusional paranoid obsession. They would use Dr. Weber's signed medical affidavit to discredit my sanity entirely. Even if the federal agents eventually believed me, untangling the legal mess of the competency injunction would take months of bureaucratic red tape. During those months, Richard would maintain complete operational control over the physical corporate office. He would use that time to shred the original paper documents, professionally wipe the servers, and move the offshore money so deep into the digital shadows that even I would never find it again. I could not afford a drawn-out legal battle in family court. I could not afford to sit back and play defense while he fortified his castle. I needed absolute, undeniable access to the boardroom, and I needed it immediately. I needed the legal authority to walk into his office, freeze his access, and hand him over to the authorities without a single judge standing in my way. To do that, I needed my father to drop the competency injunction himself entirely of his own free will. I stared at the glowing blue monitors, my mind rapidly calculating the psychology of my target. There is only one way to make a raging narcissist voluntarily drop his defenses. You have to convince him that he has already won. I had to feed his massive ego. I had to give him the one thing he loved more than stolen money, which was total humiliating submission from the people he viewed as beneath him. I looked toward the hallway, visualizing my phone sitting silently inside the kitchen drawer, currently absorbing the endless waves of Amanda's fake internet outrage. It was time to give the performance of a lifetime. They wanted me to be weak. They wanted me to be crushed by the public humiliation and the legal bullying. So I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I needed to play the exact character they had been trying to cast me as my entire life. The broken, defeated, desperate victim. I reached up and turned off the bright desk lamp, casting the room into shadows. I needed a trap, and Richard was going to enthusiastically build it for me himself. I walked out of my darkened home office and headed straight for the kitchen. I opened the drawer where I had banished my phone hours ago. The screen was still lighting up with a steady stream of notifications from Amanda's fabricated victim campaign. I picked the device up, my hands perfectly steady, but my mind shifting gears into the role I was about to play. I needed to sound exhausted. I needed to sound utterly broken. I cleared my throat a few times, deliberately making it raspy. I thought back to the worst moments of my childhood, the times my parents had made me feel completely invisible, channeling that genuine old pain to force a slight tremor into my hands and a sting of tears into my eyes. Once I felt the physical shift in my body, I pulled up my father's contact and pressed dial. It rang 4 times before he answered. He wanted me to wait. When the line finally clicked open, he did not say hello. "What do you want?" Claire Richard snapped, his voice hard and uncompromising. I let out a shaky, jagged breath, making sure the phone microphone caught the sound of my ragged inhale. "Dad," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the word. "Please, I cannot do this anymore." The line went dead silent for a moment. He had not heard me call him Dad in years. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, his massive ego suddenly perking up at the sound of my submission. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Though the aggressive edge in his voice had dialed back just a fraction, replaced by cautious, greedy curiosity, I leaned against the kitchen counter and let a single, genuine tear slide down my cheek, fueled by the sheer exhaustion of dealing with these people for over 3 decades. The videos I sobbed, keeping my tone frantic and small. Amanda's videos. The text messages from Aunt Susan and Uncle David. My phone will not stop ringing. People from my accounting firm are starting to see the posts online. "You are going to ruin my career. You are going to get me locked up in a hospital. I am so tired. I am completely alone and I cannot fight all of you. You win. You and Mom and Amanda. You win." A low, dark chuckle vibrated through the phone speaker. It was the sound of a predator standing over its prey. "I told you," Claire Richard said, his tone dripping with absolute suffocating smugness. "I told you not to test me. You thought you could walk into my world and dictate terms to me. You thought a piece of paper made you powerful. You are out of your depth. You always have been. Now you see what happens when you cross your family." I swallowed hard, forcing another ragged sob. I know I said, making my voice sound defeated and hollow. I was stupid. I just wanted grandfather to be proud of me for once. But I do not want the estate. I do not want the holding company or the legal mess. I just want to disappear. I will sign the renunciation of executorship. I will sign away my rights to Harrison Holdings. But you have to call Dr. Weber and drop the competency injunction today. If you leave that medical injunction on my record, I will lose my certified accounting license. I will have absolutely nothing. "What is in it for me?" he sneered. "Why should I lift a finger to save your miserable little career after the stunt you pulled at the restaurant? You humiliated your sister in front of her husband. You almost ruined her marriage." I gripped the edge of the granite counter. "Because I will give you total legal control," I pleaded. "But I need money to leave Seattle. I need to start over somewhere else where nobody knows my name. Drop the injunction and wire me a one-time cash buyout of $500,000. That is a tiny fraction of what the estate is worth. You get the company, you get the properties, you get everything. Just give me the cash and let me go." Silence fell over the line again. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was doing the math. $500,000 was a drop in the bucket compared to the $6.2 million he had stolen, and a minuscule price to pay to permanently silence the only person who could legally audit him. Plus, a voluntary cash buyout framed as an estate severance would look completely legitimate on paper. It was the perfect out for him. It secured his stolen wealth and validated his superiority. 500,000, he repeated, rolling the number around on his tongue. "You really are desperate, are not you? Fine. I will call Dr. Weber and have the family court injunction withdrawn immediately. I will have my lawyers draft the severance papers. But we are not doing this in some quiet back alley or over email, Claire." My stomach did a flip, but I kept my breathing shaky. "What do you mean?" I asked timidly. "If I am paying you $500,000 to walk away from my company, I want it done properly," Richard commanded, his voice swelling with arrogance. "I am calling an emergency meeting with my board of directors tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp in my corporate headquarters. You are going to walk into my boardroom in front of my executive team, my legal counsel, and your mother and sister. Jamal will be there too, so you can personally apologize for your lies." You are going to sign the legal renunciation right there on the mahogany table, so everyone in my company knows exactly who is in charge. You want the money, you surrender in public. I closed my eyes, a cold, sharp smile spreading across my face even as I forced a pathetic whimper into the phone receiver. Okay, I whispered, acting as though the demand was a crushing blow to my ultimate dignity. Okay, Dad. I will be there at 10. Just please have the paperwork ready. Make sure you dress appropriately, he scoffed. Try not to embarrass us one last time. The line clicked dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear. The pathetic shaking victim vanished, instantly evaporating into the quiet air of my apartment. I stood up straight, the cold smile remaining firmly planted on my face. He had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. His desperate narcissistic need to humiliate me in front of an audience was going to be his ultimate undoing. He was assembling the entire board of directors to watch me surrender. Instead, he was personally organizing the venue for his own execution. I walked back toward my home office, the blue light of the monitors calling me back. Tomorrow morning, the Harrison empire was going to burn to the ground, and I was going to be the one holding the match. I woke up at 5 in the morning, long before the gray Seattle sun even attempted to break through the heavy clouds. There was no lingering exhaustion from my performance the night before. I felt entirely rested, my mind operating with the sharp, cold precision of a ticking clock. Today was the day the illusion finally shattered. I opened my closet and bypassed the sensible muted cardigans my family always expected me to wear. Instead, I pulled out a sharp charcoal gray tailored suit I normally reserved for high-stakes federal depositions. I paired it with a crisp white blouse and polished black heels. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, unforgiving twist. Looking in the mirror, I did not see the broken, timid scapegoat Richard was expecting to humiliate. I saw a senior forensic accountant stepping onto the battlefield. I walked into my home office and safely disconnected my iPad from my encrypted desktop tower. I had spent the early hours of the morning transferring every single piece of evidence from grandfather's secret cloud drive onto the tablet. It held the offshore routing numbers, the Delaware Shell Company registrations, Amanda's phantom payroll records, and the catastrophic $6.2 million deficit. I slipped the iPad into my leather briefcase, treating it with the care of a loaded weapon. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a formal calendar invite forwarded from Richard's executive assistant, confirming the 10 o'clock meeting in the primary boardroom of Harrison Commercial Development. The guest list attached to the invite told me everything I needed to know about my father's suffocating arrogance. He had invited the entire corporate board of directors, the senior legal counsel, and the executive management team. He was framing this meeting as a triumphant return to stability, a public spectacle where the heroic CEO gracefully rescues the company from the clutches of a grieving, incompetent family member. Patricia and Amanda were on the guest list, undoubtedly eager to watch my final surrender and secure their luxury lifestyles. But there was one name on the invite that stood out from the rest: Jamal. After the absolute destruction of his trust at the restaurant, Jamal had refused to simply sit on the sidelines. He had sent me a brief, terse text message late last night stating he would be attending the signing. He made it perfectly clear that he was not coming to support his wife. He was coming to ensure that whatever legal transaction took place was entirely above board. Amanda had lied to him about the $400,000 secondary mortgage, and now he questioned every single financial move tied to the Harrison name. He wanted to see the exact paperwork I was signing, desperate to protect whatever was left of his own financial future. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat at the kitchen island. I had one final crucial piece of preparation to handle before I drove downtown. My father thought he had expertly outmaneuvered me by dropping the competency injunction in exchange for my signature. He assumed the legal battle was over. He was entirely unaware that the real authorities were already mobilizing. I picked up my phone and dialed a direct, unlisted number I had acquired through my firm's investigative network. The line rang twice before a stern professional voice answered. "Special Agent Miller, Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division," the voice stated. "Agent Miller, this is Claire Harrison," I replied. my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. We spoke briefly yesterday afternoon regarding the preliminary evidence of federal wire fraud and tax evasion I submitted to your secure portal. Yes, Ms. Harrison. Agent Miller said, his tone immediately shifting to high alert. My team spent the entire night reviewing the encrypted files you uploaded. The Delaware LLC cross-references and the Cayman Island routing numbers are incredibly substantial. We are currently preparing a formal inquiry, but we need the master decryption key to authenticate the raw ledgers your grandfather collected. I will do you one better, I told him. At 10 o'clock this morning, the Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Commercial Development is holding a full board meeting at his corporate headquarters. He intends to finalize a $500,000 severance buyout using the exact corporate accounts currently tied to the embezzlement scheme. He will be in the room with all the physical evidence, the board of directors, and his co-conspirators. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line as the federal agent processed the magnitude of the opportunity I was handing him. You are saying the target is localized and currently attempting to move illicit funds. Agent Miller asked, his voice sharpening with professional intensity. I am saying the target has conveniently gathered himself and his entire board into a single glass room on the top floor of his building, I corrected him. I am walking into that boardroom with the master decryption key, the original digital ledgers, and absolute proof of a $6.2 million fraud. If you want him, I suggest you have a team waiting in the lobby by 10:15. Understood, Ms. Harrison. We will be there. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. The trap was fully set. I picked up my leather briefcase, the weight of the iPad anchoring me to the reality of what was about to happen. I walked out of my apartment, locked the door, and rode the elevator down to the garage. The drive into downtown Seattle was a blur of morning traffic and gray skies. When I finally pulled into the visitor parking structure beneath the towering glass facade of Harrison Commercial Development, my heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I stepped out of my car and looked up at the massive corporate logo gleaming on the side of the building. For 34 years, this place had been a monument to my father's ego and my family's cruelty. Today, it was going to be a tomb. I gripped the handle of my briefcase, adjusted the lapels of my charcoal suit, and walked toward the glass revolving doors. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors of the Harrison Commercial Development headquarters and stepped into the expansive marble-floored lobby. The sheer scale of the building was designed to intimidate. Towering ceilings, modern art installations, and a fleet of security guards projecting an image of untouchable corporate power. The receptionist at the front desk, a woman who had worked there for 10 years and had always offered me polite smiles on my rare visits, completely avoided my gaze today. She had undoubtedly seen Amanda's crying videos online. She quickly tapped a button under her desk to unlock the private executive elevator bank, keeping her eyes glued to her computer monitor. I did not take it personally. She was just another innocent person caught in the blast radius of my family's fabricated reality. I stepped into the wood-paneled elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the heavy doors slid shut, sealing me in absolute silence, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace settle over my entire body. I was not nervous. I was not shaking. For my entire life, riding this elevator up to my father's office meant preparing myself for criticism, belittlement, and emotional exhaustion. But today the gravity had completely reversed. I was not riding up to his kingdom to beg for scraps of approval. I was riding up to dismantle the throne. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors glided open to reveal the plush charcoal carpet of the executive suite. I walked past the empty assistant desks and approached the massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the primary boardroom. Through the pristine glass, I could see the entire trap laid out perfectly before me, exactly as Richard had promised. The room was bathed in the cold gray morning light reflecting off the Seattle skyline. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by luxurious leather executive chairs. Sitting directly at the head of the table, his back to the panoramic view of the city, was my father. He was practically glowing with absolute unchecked arrogance. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit, leaning back in his chair with his hands steepled in front of him. He looked like a triumphant general accepting the surrender of a conquered nation. Lining the left side of the table were the senior board members and the corporate legal counsel. 7 older men in expensive suits, all looking varying degrees of uncomfortable stern or professionally detached. They were the financial backbone of the company, the men who rubber-stamped my father's projects and trusted his inflated revenue projections. On the right side of the table sat my family. My mother Patricia looked impeccably dressed in a pale cashmere sweater, though her posture was tight and impatient. Next to her was Amanda, who was busy pretending to look fragile and exhausted, taking small sips from a crystal water glass and keeping her eyes cast downward. But I could see the faint, triumphant smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Sitting a full chair away from Amanda, deliberately creating physical distance between himself and his wife, was Jamal. He did not look at Amanda, and he did not look at my parents. His jaw was set like stone, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. When I walked through the heavy glass doors into the room, Jamal was the only person who met my eyes with a look of searching, desperate clarity. He gave me a single, nearly imperceptible nod. He was not there to support the Harrison family. He was there to witness the truth, whatever it might be. The quiet murmurs in the boardroom died instantly the moment my heels clicked against the hardwood border of the floor. Every head turned toward me. The heavy, suffocating weight of their collective judgment pressed into the room. "Ah, Claire," my father announced, his voice booming with patronizing warmth. He stood up and buttoned his suit jacket, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch perfectly for his audience. "Thank you for joining us. I know this has been an incredibly difficult week for you. Grief does terrible things to the mind, and we all understand that you have not been yourself lately." He gestured vaguely to the board members, offering them a look of deep, fake paternal sorrow. "Gentlemen, as I explained earlier, my daughter has realized that the pressure of handling her grandfather's estate is simply too much for her current mental state. We are here today to officially relieve her of that immense burden so she can focus on getting the psychiatric help she so desperately needs, and so this company can move forward without any further disruption." I walked slowly toward the only empty chair left in the room, positioned directly across from my father, at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I set my heavy leather briefcase down on the polished wood. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sigh that echoed in the quiet room. She leaned forward, resting her diamond-ringed hands on the table. "Just sign it quickly so we can be a family again, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with tired condescension. "This has been entirely too much drama, and your father has important corporate business to attend to. Please, just do the right thing for once." Richard reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his favorite heavy gold fountain pen. He picked up a thick stapled stack of legal documents resting in front of him. Attached to the very front of the contract with a silver paperclip was a cashier's check printed with my name stamped with the amount of $500,000. He slid the ironclad renunciation contract firmly across the long mahogany table. The thick paper made a loud scratching sound against the wood before coming to a stop directly in front of my briefcase. He tossed the gold pen and it clattered to a halt right next to the signature line. "I want this witnessed and notarized immediately," Richard instructed his senior legal counsel, who sat quietly with his own notary stamp ready. The entire room went completely still. The board members leaned forward slightly. Amanda finally looked up, her eyes locked hungrily on the paperwork. Patricia held her breath. Richard stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, waiting for his ultimate victory lap to be cemented in ink. They all expected me to break down crying, grab the pen, take the money, and run away in shame. I looked down at the contract. I looked at the cashier's check funded by the very corporate accounts he was actively bleeding dry. I reached out and slowly picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. The room held its breath. The silence was so absolute I could hear the faint hum of the climate control system overhead. I held the pen over the signature line, and then I stopped. I did not let the nib touch the paper. I did not shake, and I did not cry. Moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness, I pulled the cap off the back of the pen and snapped it firmly over the tip. The sharp click echoed like a gunshot in the silent boardroom. I set the capped pen down on top of the $500,000 check. I lifted my chin completely, bypassing my father's sudden confused frown, and looked directly down the left side of the table, locking eyes with the senior board of directors. I kept my eyes locked on the senior board members as I reached into my leather briefcase. My father's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a sudden sharp twitch of irritation. "What are you doing, Claire?" Richard snapped, his voice losing its fake warmth. "The pen is right there. Sign the document so we can conclude this meeting." I ignored him. I pulled my iPad from the briefcase along with a universal display adapter I had made sure to pack in my purse that morning. I stood up from my chair and walked the few short steps to the digital podium at the end of the table. The boardroom was equipped with a state-of-the-art projection system featuring a massive 80-inch smart screen mounted directly behind my father's chair. Claire Patricia warned, her tone sharp and embarrassed. "Stop making a scene. People are busy, and we do not have time for your theatrics." I plugged the adapter into the central console and connected my tablet. I tapped the screen mirror icon. The massive monitor behind my father instantly flickered to life, casting a bright, harsh blue glare over his shoulders. But the screen did not display a signed renunciation contract. It displayed a highly organized master spreadsheet accompanied by high-resolution side-by-side scans of official banking documents. The 7 board members sitting on the left side of the table simultaneously squinted, adjusting their reading glasses as they tried to process the sudden influx of data. "What is this nonsense?" Richard demanded, twisting around in his heavy leather chair to look at the screen. "Turn that off right now." I tapped my iPad, expanding the first set of documents, so the text was massive and undeniable. "Gentlemen of the board," I announced, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a blade. "You were brought here today under the false pretense that I am mentally unfit to manage the Harrison estate. You were told I was surrendering my legal authority to save this company. That was a lie." I looked directly at the senior legal counsel, who was already leaning forward, his eyes locked onto the Cayman Island routing numbers displayed on the screen. "I am not here to sign over the estate," I continued, my voice like ice. "I am here to execute it." At 6 o'clock this morning, my legal team filed an emergency federal injunction officially reinstating my unmitigated authority as the sole executor of Harrison Holdings. The moment Richard voluntarily dropped his fraudulent competency hold to secure my signature today, he completely restored my legal jurisdiction. Richard stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. "You arrogant little brat!" he roared, his face turning an explosive shade of crimson. "Turn that screen off immediately, or I will have security throw you out of this building." "Security does not answer to you anymore, Richard," I replied smoothly. I tapped the tablet again. The screen transitioned to the Delaware LLC registration records, perfectly overlaid with the internal corporate expense reports of Harrison Commercial Development. "I am here today in my official capacity as the legal executor," I stated, projecting my voice so every single person in the room heard me clearly over my father's shouting. "And as the majority shareholder of the umbrella corporation that owns the land beneath this very building, I am here to officially terminate Richard Harrison as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, for the systematic multi-year embezzlement of $6.2 million. Pandemonium erupted in the boardroom. 3 of the board members jumped to their feet simultaneously. The senior legal counsel practically lunged across the mahogany table to get a closer look at the offshore wire transfer receipts I had just swiped onto the screen. The numbers were irrefutable. The executives saw their own corporate letterheads stamped alongside phantom invoices from Apex Global Solutions and a dozen other fake consulting firms. Patricia let out a horrified, breathless shriek, covering her mouth with both trembling hands as she stared at the screen. She recognized the dates on the wire transfers. They perfectly matched the weeks she had purchased her designer jewelry, her luxury cars, and her extravagant vacations. I swiped the screen one more time, bringing up the internal payroll ledgers and the forged tax forms. "And it is not just corporate embezzlement," I added, my eyes flicking over to my sister. "It is payroll fraud. For the last 5 years, Richard has been paying Amanda a salary of $200,000 for a phantom executive position that does not exist, using your approved construction budgets to fund her personal lifestyle. This is a lie. Richard screamed, his voice cracking violently as raw panic entirely consumed him. He slammed his fists down onto the mahogany table, knocking over his crystal water glass. She is insane. I told you all she was having a psychological breakdown. These documents are completely fabricated. She photoshopped them to frame me because she is a jealous, bitter, hysterical woman. He looked wildly at the board members, desperate to maintain his illusion of control. Do not look at that screen, he ordered them, spit flying from his lips. I built this company. I am the CEO. I order you to ignore her. But nobody was looking at him. The men who had trusted him with their investments were entirely captivated by the digital autopsy of his empire playing out in high definition. Every time I tapped my finger against the glass of my tablet, another massive financial crime was laid bare for the executives to see. I showed them the fake architectural steel invoices. I showed them the highly leveraged debt hiding behind their newest luxury retail park. I was systematically dismantling his entire life's work stroke by stroke in front of the exact audience he had gathered to watch me fail. My father continued to scream his denials, his voice echoing harshly off the pristine glass walls, but his words were completely useless. The spell of his authority was broken. The 7 senior board members stopped listening to him and started looking entirely out for themselves. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from confusion to panicked self-preservation. The senior legal counsel did not even bother to argue with my father. He simply reached over, grabbed his leather briefcase and began violently stuffing his notebooks inside. He pulled his cell phone from his breast pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he furiously dialed his own private criminal defense attorney. 2 other executives pushed their heavy chairs back and stood up, physically distancing themselves from the head of the table, as if my father's proximity alone would legally indict them. They were wealthy, powerful men who had spent their entire careers avoiding liability. They knew exactly what federal wire fraud looked like, and they were not going to go down with a sinking ship. While the corporate side of the room was collapsing into chaos, the family side of the room was experiencing a much deeper, much quieter kind of devastation. I shifted my gaze away from the scrambling executives and looked down the table at Jamal. He was still sitting perfectly upright in his chair, completely frozen. He was not looking at the offshore accounts or the Cayman Island routing numbers that had the board members so terrified. His dark brown eyes were locked entirely onto the specific payroll ledger displaying Amanda's name and her $200,000 annual salary. I watched Jamal do the math in his head. I watched the horrible, sickening realization wash over his strong features. At the restaurant 3 days ago, he had learned that Amanda forged his signature to take out a $400,000 loan against their home to bail out her father. That alone was a massive betrayal of marital trust. But looking at the brightly lit projector screen now, Jamal realized the full grotesque scope of the lie. Amanda was not just a desperate daughter trying to save her family from a sudden financial ruin. She was on the payroll. She was pulling in an executive salary of stolen corporate money every single year. She had let Jamal work grueling 70-hour weeks at his architecture firm to pay their daily bills while she secretly hoarded hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit cash. She had risked their shared home and his entire financial future for absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated greed. Jamal slowly stood up from his chair. His movements were stiff and deliberate, like a man trying to walk through deep, freezing water. The sudden motion caught Amanda's attention. She tore her eyes away from the damning projector screen and looked up at her husband. "Jamal, please," Amanda whispered. Her voice cracked, completely stripped of its usual theatrical polish and manipulation. "Let me explain this. I can explain all of it. It is not what it looks like." Jamal did not yell. He did not curse at her, and he did not demand an apology. He just looked down at her with an expression of absolute profound emptiness. It was the kind of terrifying emptiness that only comes when the person you love completely ceases to exist in your eyes. He reached over with his right hand and firmly gripped the simple gold wedding band resting on his left ring finger. "No," Amanda gasped. She scrambled to stand up her chair, screeching harshly against the hardwood floor. "No, Jamal, please stop. Do not do this right now. We can talk about this at home." Jamal pulled the gold band firmly over his knuckle. He did not throw it. He did not toss it at her in a fit of rage. He simply extended his hand and placed the ring gently onto the polished mahogany table. The small piece of metal made a soft, incredibly final clinking sound as it settled against the expensive wood. It was the quietest sound in the room, yet it somehow drowned out all the shouting and panic around them. Without speaking a single word to her, to my parents, or to anyone else in the room, Jamal turned his back on the Harrison family. He walked steadily toward the heavy glass doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the toxic atmosphere of our family behind him forever. Amanda let out a guttural, agonizing sob. It was the first genuine sound of pain I had ever heard her make in her entire life. She stumbled away from the table, completely ignoring my mother, who was reaching out frantically to grab her arm. Amanda sprinted out the boardroom doors, her high heels echoing down the corridor as she chased after a man who was already gone. The sound of Amanda's hysterical crying faded down the hallway, leaving a heavy, suffocating tension inside the boardroom. Patricia buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as her perfect, curated life shattered into millions of unfixable pieces. She was crying for her lost country club status, her yacht, and her public reputation. And then there was Richard. My father stood entirely alone at the head of the table. His loyal board of directors had abandoned him. His golden child's marriage had just imploded right in front of his eyes. His hidden ledgers were glowing in high definition on the wall behind him, broadcasting his crimes to the entire room. The absolute control he had wielded over this family and this company for decades was completely gone, ripped away by the daughter he had spent his entire life treating like garbage. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. The frantic panic in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by pure, unadulterated, murderous rage. He let out a primal, guttural roar that tore from deep within his chest and lunged forward. He shoved a heavy leather executive chair out of his way, sending it crashing violently to the floor, and charged down the length of the mahogany table directly toward me. His fists were clenched white, his face twisted in a terrifying mask of violent hatred. He wanted to physically destroy the person who had destroyed his empire. I stood my ground, my hands resting calmly on the wooden podium, my heart pounding a steady, fearless rhythm against my ribs. I did not flinch, and I did not step back. Richard was only 10 feet away from me, his arm pulling back to strike when the heavy glass boardroom doors suddenly swung violently open, stopping him completely dead in his tracks. Richard froze, his fist still tightly clenched by his side. The sudden, forceful opening of the heavy glass doors shattered the momentum of his attack. Two men walked into the boardroom, moving with the kind of synchronized, undeniable authority that you cannot buy with an expensive suit or a corner office. They were flanked by two armed, uniformed federal officers, whose presence immediately sucked the remaining air out of the room. The man in the front, wearing a plain gray suit and a stern, uncompromising expression, held up a leather wallet displaying a gold shield. "Richard Harrison," the man said, his voice easily cutting through the panicked murmurs of the remaining board members. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." My father lowered his arm. The murderous rage that had consumed his face just a fraction of a second ago was instantly wiped clean, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. He took a stumbling step backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor. He looked from the federal agents to the glowing projector screen behind him, and then finally to me. He suddenly understood that my performance on the phone last night was not a surrender. It was the final nail in his coffin. I had not just brought the evidence to the boardroom to embarrass him. I had used his own meeting as a holding pen to keep him in one place while the federal authorities mobilized. Agent Miller stepped further into the room, his eyes sweeping over the massive digital spreadsheets displayed on the wall, before locking firmly onto my father. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion," Miller stated smoothly. Richard held up his hands, completely abandoning his aggressive posture. He desperately tried to summon the smooth, charismatic executive persona that had manipulated banks, city planners, and our family for decades. "Now hold on just a minute, Agent Miller," Richard stammered, his voice trembling slightly but attempting to project confidence. "There has been a massive misunderstanding here. This is a private corporate dispute. My daughter is going through a severe psychological crisis due to grief. She is confused about the accounting ledgers. If you just give my legal team a moment to clarify the situation." Agent Miller did not even blink. He reached behind his back and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "We already have the master decryption keys to your offshore accounts, Mr. Harrison," the agent replied flatly, gesturing toward the projector screen. "And your own daughter just handed us the entire undeniable paper trail. There is no misunderstanding. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The remaining board members scrambled out of the way, pressing themselves against the glass walls as the uniformed officers moved in to assist Agent Miller. Richard looked around the room, his eyes wide with wild, trapped desperation. He looked at the executives he had commanded for years, the men who had just minutes ago treated him like a king. He silently begged them to intervene, to vouch for his character, to use their power to stop the arrest. But they all looked away. They were treating him like a highly contagious disease. The uniformed officers grabbed my father by the shoulders and spun him around. He let out a weak, pathetic gasp as they forcibly pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp mechanical click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the boardroom. It was the sound of an entire empire collapsing into dust. My father did not fight back. The sheer reality of the handcuffs, the cold metal pressing against his skin, seemed to break whatever fragile delusion of power he had left. His shoulders slumped forward and his head dropped toward his chest. The titan of commercial real estate, the man who had terrified me for 34 years, was suddenly nothing more than a common criminal in a wrinkled suit. Agent Miller began reading him his Miranda rights, the standard legal recitation ringing out in the quiet, expansive room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." But the heavy silence in the room was suddenly shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek. Patricia had been standing near the edge of the mahogany table, completely paralyzed by shock since Jamal walked out. But seeing her husband in handcuffs finally snapped her out of her stupor. She lunged forward, her expensive cashmere sweater snagging on the edge of a leather chair as she ran toward the federal agents. "Stop it!" my mother screamed, her voice hitting a shrill, deafening pitch. "What are you doing? Take those off him right now. You cannot arrest him. Do you know who we are? Do you know who he is?" A uniformed officer quickly stepped into her path, holding up a firm hand to keep her away from Richard. "Ma'am, you need to step back immediately and do not interfere with a federal arrest," the officer warned her, his hand hovering near his utility belt. Patricia ignored him. She pivoted wildly, her eyes darting around the room until they landed on me. Her face was streaked with running makeup, her perfectly styled hair falling frantically into her eyes. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "Claire, do something," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. "Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you made the documents up. Tell them you are sorry. He is your father. He gave you everything. You cannot let them take him away. Stop this right now." I stood behind the podium, completely unfazed by her screaming. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life belittling my achievements, ignoring my pain, and actively participating in my psychological torment. She was not crying because she loved her husband. She was crying because she knew the bank accounts were about to be frozen. She was crying because the country club memberships were gone, the yacht was gone, and her entire identity as a wealthy, superior socialite had just been handcuffed and read its rights. She was staring at the terrifying reality of becoming exactly what she had always mocked an ordinary broke citizen. I reached down and disconnected my iPad from the projector cable. The massive blue screen behind my father went completely black, plunging that side of the room into its natural gray morning shadows. I picked up my tablet and slid it securely into my leather briefcase. I closed the brass buckles, the sharp snaps echoing softly over my mother's continuous sobbing. I looked at her. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. I looked at my mother and simply said, "You enabled a thief for 30 years. I am just auditing the results." Patricia physically recoiled as if I had struck her across the face. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. She looked at me with total terrifying comprehension. She finally realized that the daughter she had always dismissed as a weak, insignificant desk clerk was the exact person who had orchestrated her absolute ruin. She realized that there would be no forgiveness, no rescue, and no second chances. Agent Miller finished reading my father his rights. "Let us go, Mr. Harrison," the agent said, giving my father a firm push toward the door. Richard did not look back at me as they marched him out of his own boardroom. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, his spirit completely broken, entirely stripped of the arrogant smirk he had worn just a half hour ago. The federal agents escorted him through the heavy glass doors, leading him toward the executive elevators, and out of my life forever. Patricia collapsed into one of the leather chairs, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably into the quiet, empty space. The remaining executives quietly gathered their belongings and slipped out of the room, leaving nothing behind but the shattered remnants of my family's toxic legacy. The silence in the boardroom after the federal agents escorted my father out was absolute. My mother sat slumped in her leather chair for another 10 minutes, weeping into her hands until she finally realized no one was coming to comfort her. She picked up her designer purse and stumbled out of the room without looking at me. Once the glass doors closed behind her, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the managing partner of my forensic accounting firm. Within an hour, a team of 5 independent auditors arrived at the building. I handed them the master decryption keys and gave the order to completely lock down the corporate network, seize every physical file in the executive suite, and change the security access codes for the entire building. The reign of Richard Harrison was officially over, and the cleanup had begun. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely public. By Tuesday morning, the arrest of a prominent commercial real estate tycoon was front-page news across the Pacific Northwest business journals. The local media had a field day with the details of the federal indictment outlining the phantom shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the millions of dollars stolen from his own family empire. My father was arraigned in federal court 2 days later. He walked into the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking completely unrecognizable. His hair was unkempt, his posture was hunched, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been entirely extinguished. His high-priced defense attorneys tried to argue for his release on bail, citing his deep community ties and lack of prior criminal history. But the federal prosecutor immediately presented the evidence of his active Cayman Island accounts, painting him as an extreme flight risk who had the hidden financial means to disappear overnight. The judge agreed. Bail was denied, and my father was remanded back to the federal detention center to await trial. Things only got worse for him from there. When the government officially froze his personal assets pending the criminal investigation, his elite legal team suddenly realized they were not going to get paid. They dropped him as a client within the week, forcing the great corporate titan to rely on an overworked public defender. Facing a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, forged signatures, and documented wire fraud, my father had absolutely no leverage. A month later, he agreed to a plea deal to avoid spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud and tax evasion, securing a guaranteed sentence of 12 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who had once mocked my modest apartment was now moving into an 8 by 10 concrete cell. While my father was navigating the criminal justice system, my sister Amanda was facing her own personal apocalypse. Jamal did not wait around to hear her excuses. The very morning after the boardroom confrontation, he hired one of the most ruthless and efficient divorce attorneys in the city. Jamal had always been the primary breadwinner of their household, while Amanda had secretly hoarded her $200,000 phantom salary. But because she had committed documented financial fraud by forging Jamal's signature on the secondary mortgage, she had effectively destroyed her legal standing in the divorce proceedings. Jamal filed an emergency motion to secure their remaining legitimate assets, citing her criminal liability. The judge granted it immediately. Amanda was legally forced out of the beautiful lakeside home she had constantly bragged about. Her luxury SUV, which was leased under my father's defunct holding company, was repossessed right out of the driveway. She had no job, no legitimate income history, and a sudden massive debt tied to the fraudulent mortgage she had taken out. Desperate for sympathy, Amanda tried to run her old playbook. She posted another crying video on her social media, claiming she was a victim of our father's manipulation and my cruel vengeance. But the internet had already read the federal indictment. They knew about her fake executive salary. Instead of support, she was met with a tidal wave of public backlash. Brands she used to partner with dropped her instantly. Her wealthy socialite friends stopped returning her calls, terrified that any association with the Harrison family would invite an audit into their own lives. She was completely isolated, moving into a cheap, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, utterly broke and entirely alone. My mother, Patricia, experienced perhaps the most dramatic fall from grace. For her entire life, she had believed that her worth was tied to her zip code, her jewelry collection, and her social standing. She had turned a blind eye to my father's cruelty and corruption because it funded her perfect reality. But the Internal Revenue Service does not care about country club status. Because my mother had knowingly signed joint tax returns for years while enjoying the proceeds of an illegal enterprise, the government came for everything. I stood on the sidewalk across from my parents' sprawling estate one chilly Tuesday morning and watched the federal asset forfeiture team go to work. It was a methodical, unfeeling process. 2 tow trucks backed into the long circular driveway and hauled away my father's imported sports car and my mother's luxury sedan. Federal agents carried boxes of financial records and appraised valuables out the front door. The massive diamond tennis bracelet she had worn to the will reading was confiscated to help pay down the millions in back taxes they owed the federal government. Within a matter of weeks, Patricia's country club revoked her membership, citing a zero-tolerance policy for convicted felons and their immediate associates. The charity board she had served on quietly asked her to step down. The bank foreclosed on the sprawling colonial estate, giving her exactly 30 days to pack up whatever unseized personal belongings she had left and vacate the premises. The woman who had spent 30 years looking down her nose at the rest of the world was suddenly forced to pack her entire life into a few cardboard boxes. Through it all, I remained firmly in control of Harrison Holdings. Working alongside my forensic accounting team, I systematically untangled the massive web of debt my father had created. I liquidated the empty shell companies, successfully renegotiated the fraudulent construction loans, and stabilized the core assets of the umbrella corporation. It was exhausting, meticulous work, but for the first time in my life, I was building something real. I was protecting my grandfather's true legacy, not the fake, flashy empire my father had pretended to run. The legitimate holding company, legally protected and separated from Richard's criminal enterprise, remained entirely intact. And as the sole executor and majority shareholder, I controlled every single cent of it. The irony of the situation was almost poetic. For over 3 decades, my family had treated me like a pathetic, invisible burden. They had laughed at my career, mocked my lifestyle, and tried to strip me of my inheritance because they genuinely believed they were untouchable. They thought their money, their lies, and their aggressive manipulation would always protect them from the consequences of their actions. But the dust had finally settled. The mansion was gone. The fake executive salaries were gone. The offshore accounts had been seized by the federal government. Richard was sitting in a prison cell, and Amanda and Patricia were facing the terrifying reality of having to actually work for a living. The social hierarchy of our family had been completely obliterated. They were entirely destitute. The only legitimate money left in the world that belonged to the Harrison name was locked safely inside the holding company. And I was the only person on earth who had the key. The family that had spent my entire life laughing at me, undermining my confidence, and treating me like garbage had run out of options. They had nowhere left to turn. And so the inevitable finally happened. The people who had tried to destroy me were now coming to beg for my mercy. Exactly 6 months later, the receptionist at my new executive office buzzed my private line. I was no longer working out of the cramped cubicle at my old forensic accounting firm. I was sitting behind a massive, sleek glass desk in the newly renovated CEO suite of Harrison Holdings. I had spent the last half year completely gutting the corporate headquarters, tearing out the suffocating dark mahogany paneling my father had installed, and replacing it with open glass, natural light, and transparent accounting departments. "Ms. Harrison," my assistant said over the intercom, her voice laced with polite hesitation. "Your mother is in the lobby. She does not have an appointment, but she is insisting that she needs to speak with you. She says it is a family emergency." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Seattle skyline. A family emergency. For 34 years, my family emergencies consisted of Amanda breaking a nail or my father needing someone to blame for a misplaced golf club. "Send her up," I replied calmly. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors to my suite opened and Patricia walked in. If I had passed her on the street, I might not have recognized her. The transformation was staggering. The woman who had spent decades meticulously curating her high society image was completely gone. She was wearing a beige trench coat from at least 3 seasons ago. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unkempt knot, and the heavy diamond jewelry she used to flaunt like armor was entirely absent, having been seized and auctioned off by the federal government. She looked small, frail, and incredibly tired. Her eyes darted around my expansive corner office, taking in the absolute authority I now possessed. She walked slowly toward my desk and stood there wringing her bare hands together. She did not look like a proud matriarch anymore. She looked like a beggar. "Sit down, Patricia," I said, gesturing to one of the modern guest chairs opposite my desk. She sank into the chair, letting out a heavy, ragged sigh. She looked at me, her eyes immediately filling with tears that I knew were only half genuine. The other half was pure, calculated survival instinct. "Claire." She began, her voice trembling as she leaned forward. "You look wonderful. The office is beautiful. You have done so well for yourself." I did not offer a polite thank you. I simply folded my hands on top of my desk and waited. I knew she had not come to my office to compliment my interior design choices. She swallowed hard, her fake smile faltering under my icy silence. "Things are so bad, Claire," she whispered, letting the tears spill over her eyelashes. "Your father calls me from the federal penitentiary, and the connection is so awful and he is so miserable. He looks terrible, and Amanda is struggling so much. She is living in a horrible little studio apartment next to a highway. She cannot find a job because her name is ruined in this city. Jamal will not even speak to her, and the lawyers took absolutely everything in the divorce." She paused, waiting for me to offer a word of sympathy, a gasp of concern, or any sign that my emotional boundaries were weakening. When I offered nothing but a steady, unblinking stare, the desperation in her voice amplified. "I am completely broke, Claire," she sobbed, clutching the lapels of her old coat. "The government took the house, they took the cars, they took my retirement accounts. I am renting a room in a terrible neighborhood, and I cannot even afford to buy groceries this week. Please, I know your father made mistakes. I know things were not perfect when you were growing up, but we are blood. I am your mother. You have millions of dollars sitting in this holding company. You are living the life we were supposed to have. I am just asking for a small monthly allowance from the estate, just $5,000 a month, just enough to help me and your sister survive. Please, Claire, you cannot just turn your back on your own family. I sat perfectly still observing her performance with the same clinical detachment I used to audit fraudulent tax returns. She had not offered a single apology for 34 years of emotional abuse. She had not apologized for standing by while my father tried to have me committed to a psychiatric ward. She had not apologized for Amanda stealing from Jamal. She was just doing what she had always done. She was trying to manipulate the narrative to serve her own selfish needs, weaponizing the concept of family, only when it was convenient and profitable for her. I reached across my pristine glass desk and picked up a heavy polished silver tissue box. I slid it slowly across the smooth surface until it bumped gently against the edge right in front of her. Patricia looked down at the tissue box, her face lighting up with a brief, pathetic flicker of hope. She thought the tears had worked. She reached out and pulled a tissue, dabbing her eyes, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and reinstate her luxury lifestyle. Go find another daughter, Patricia, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute finality. This one is closed for business. Her hand froze mid-air. The fake, hopeful expression shattered, replaced by raw, unadulterated shock. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately searched for a counterattack, a guilt trip, or a threat that might force me to comply. But she had no ammunition left. She was sitting in my building begging for my money, completely stripped of her power. I will have security escort you to the lobby, I told her, pressing the intercom button on my phone. Do not come back to this building. If you or Amanda attempt to contact me again, I will have my legal team file a permanent restraining order for harassment. Goodbye, Patricia. She did not scream. She did not argue. The absolute coldness in my eyes told her that the well was permanently dry. She dropped the crumpled tissue onto my desk, slowly pushed herself out of the chair, and shuffled out of my office. I watched her walk through the heavy glass doors, her shoulders slumped in total defeat, fading into the busy corporate hallway until she was completely gone. That weekend, I drove out of the city and headed deep into the mountains. I pulled my car up the winding pine-lined driveway of the lakeside estate in Coeur d'Alene. This was the sprawling, beautiful summer home that Amanda had so arrogantly claimed at the will reading. The house she had demanded to inherit. But because the property was technically owned by Harrison Holdings, it had remained completely untouched by the federal seizures. It was entirely legally and rightfully mine. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, peaceful, and filled with the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun bouncing off the lake. I walked through the massive living room, poured myself a cup of hot coffee, and stepped out onto the expansive cedar balcony. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs. The towering pine trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the water below was as smooth as glass. For my entire life, I had been told that I was the black sheep. I had been made to feel small, invisible, and unworthy of the space I occupied. My family had acted like a pack of starving wolves, constantly circling me, waiting for me to expose my throat so they could tear me down and feed their own massive egos. But as I stood on that balcony, leaning against the wooden railing and looking out over the incredible landscape that I now owned, I realized something profound. I did not just survive the wolves. I bought the forest, and I evicted them from it. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a deep, radiating warmth spread through my chest. The trauma of my past no longer dictated the trajectory of my future. I had dismantled a criminal empire, protected my grandfather's true legacy, and built a fortress of absolute peace for myself. If you are watching this right now and you are dealing with a family that constantly makes you feel like you are difficult to love, I need you to hear this. Your worth is not determined by the people who refuse to see your value. Do not let them convince you that your boundaries are an act of betrayal. Keep your receipts. Trust your own intellect, focus on your independence, and refuse to shrink yourself just to keep toxic people comfortable in their delusions. The blood in your veins does not obligate you to endure abuse. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let them face the consequences of their own actions, while you quietly walk away and build a kingdom they are no longer allowed to enter. Thank you for listening to my story. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own strength. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. Remember, the best revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you, it is building a beautiful life without them.